Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking, they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries.
When I came here, you were nothing. You weren't even a gang. I formed you.
Who says?
Well, read them a clipping news.
Which one?
Any of them.
This one here's from Salt Lake Herald. Butch Cassidy's Hole in the Wall gang struck
Butch Cassidy's Hole in the Wall gang, that's me.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid weren't actually all that famous until the movie starring Paul Newman and Robert Redford came out in 1969. Truth is, they weren't even much of a duo for most of their criminal escapades, but were just two guys who hung around some other people they knew who loosely, and I do mean very loosely, made up something called the Wild Bunch. None of this takes away from the glamour and glory that sticks to them. That's because they were the last of the great, almost gentlemen robbers who weren't in it for the killing, just for the money and maybe the chase that came after. They were like Robin Hood, in a way. They didn't take money or gold watches or precious gems from train passengers or banking customers when they boarded trains or entered banks to take the money from the corporate entities therein. Some passengers and customers even offered up their goods, and, really and truly, Butch, who was usually the leader when he was on the job, would tell the average citizen to put it away. He was also quite anti-violent, despite his willingness to point a gun in the direction of the living to make them do his bidding. But when one of his bunch pistol-whipped a bank clerk who didn't move fast enough, Butch yelled out something like, "None of that crap," and there was no more of it. That stuff will make you a legend, I guess, in a place where news didn't travel fast, but stories of nice robbers did. Butch and Sundance also became legends because, let's face it, they looked pretty good doing it. Butch was sandy-haired and blue-eyed and square-jawed. In his younger years, he stares from mugshot circa 1884 with a bit of a Cro-Magnon look, kind of beefy-faced and thick between the brows. But as he aged, his face slimmed and, I dare say, he took on a distinguished air. Sundance was tall and lean and, based on the few photos that still exist of him, was a pretty attractive fellow himself. It was also true that these men worked at their, let's just call them jobs, when the romantic yet incredibly harsh American West was dying. It was all Gilded Age in the East, with those robber barons and government types on the Atlantic coast infringing on the Western plains with their trains and their rules and their genocide of the natives that lived there. These were not those cowboys. These cowboys were rugged, hard-working guys who didn't mind dust and didn't mind anyone's business but their own. Butch belonged in the West he was born in. Sundance belonged because he purposely set out there when he was 14. Both were horsemen of the highest caliber and could shoot the ace out of a flurry of cards. Butch, when he had to find farm work in between his forays into the criminal world, was considered by everyone who hired him as the hardest worker they had ever had. Hype, you ask? No, diaries attest to this. So do newspapers of the day, as do personal papers and eyewitness testimony. The few times they were caught, they were hounded by town sheriffs and the occasional governor who just asked that they try their best to work in another state next time. But mostly they were hounded by the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which had been hired by the Union Pacific Railroad because, well, they used dynamite to open the safes on their trains, and that had to end. So fancy men like the Pinkertons chased the all-American Robin Hoods to hell and back. That is, until the two men decided to hightail it to South America for a second chance at life. They had plans to go straight, race horses, and elude the law. Legend has it, that didn't exactly go as planned. That's the legend that says Butch and Sundance died in a shootout in Bolivia. But there's another legend too, and in that one, the men didn't die there at all. In that one, they won the ultimate game of hide and seek. Their supposed big showdown happened more than 100 years ago. So how come we still don't know where they died, or when, or how? Did they get the last laugh? Did they live to be old men with secrets? Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Galatea by Inkit. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Reading is like meditation for me. When I'm getting stressed out, I know it's time to set aside time for reading. Do you find that, Scott?
I do. That's something we have in common.
And it's where Galatea comes in mighty handy. Galatea is a reading app where everyone craving a little me time can dive into a library of romance stories that leave you feeling recharged and fulfilled.
There are over 1,000 bestsellers to choose from shifter romance to bad boy billionaires, forbidden love, werewolf alphas, slow burn fantasy, teen drama, and much, much more.
You saying bad boy billionaires is now my favorite thing. Ads are fun.
You know what else is fun? Over 30 million people have fallen in love with reading on Galatea. Join now to indulge in stories that make you feel like yourself.
Right now, Galatea is offering our listeners an extra 25% off on top of an already irresistibly affordable subscription when you go to galatea.com/COTC. That's GALATEA.com/COTC to indulge in unlimited stories for even less.
Galatea.com/COTC.
Butch Cassidy was, of course, not born Butch Cassidy in either the literal or figurative sense. He was born Robert Bob Leroy Parker, and his upbringing wasn't exactly the kind you picture when you typically think of Old West outlaws.
But one of the most surprising things about Butch Cassidy to me is that he grew up a Mormon, or as we prefer to be called, a Latter-day Saint.
This is Casey Griffiths in a documentary by ScriptureCentral.com. Admittedly, not a source we use here often at Crimes of the Centuries, but hey, they fit this time.
His real name was Robert Leroy Parker, and he was named after both of his grandfathers, Robert Parker and Robert Giles, who immigrated here. Both of these men converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints while they lived in Great Britain. And then they crossed the plains from the cool and pleasant British Isles to the hot Utah desert.
Bob Parker was the eldest of 13 children born to Mormon parents in Circleville, Utah, in an area that is now Bryce Canyon National Park. Gorgeous country. Author and historian Charles River Editors tells us a man named Mike Cassidy was a frequent cowhand on the Parker farm, and he was the one who taught Bob how to shoot, ride horses, rope, and brand cattle. Mike was only a year older than Bob, but he knew the stuff Bob yearned to know. Some speculate that it is Mike Cassidy who showed young Bob that life was more than farming, and later, as a tribute, Bob took his last name to show his appreciation. Bob may have needed a big brother, or an excuse to do anything but be flat broke in the middle of nowhere with Mormon parents whom the other Mormons shunned because they weren't particularly good Mormons. Though it's said that Bob/Butch was never that fond of drinking and his taking up with the ladies of the night was less regular than those young bucks he hung with. There are some who suggest that Butch may have enjoyed the company of men, which wasn't that uncommon out there in the big lonesome prairie. Sex was sex. Charles Learson, author of Butch Cassidy, The True Story of an American Outlaw, quoted biologist and noted investigator of sexual habits Alfred Kinsey as saying, quote, "There was a fair amount of sexual contact among the older males in western rural areas, a type of homosexuality that was probably common among pioneers and outdoor men in general," end quote. Kinsey went on to say that such behavior rarely conflicts with their heterosexual relations. Around these parts, we just call that being bisexual. Later in his book, Learson notes that women generally fought over Butch, though he seemed never to favor one over another, despite his willingness to entertain them. It was a hard life. You got your kicks where you could. By the time Bob was 16, he was alleged to have been the best shot in those parts. The historians make a point that, at that time and beyond, there is absolutely no disagreement that Bob was a tremendously likable charmer who did not care for authority and thought rules were for other people. But he had rules for himself. In fact, in the Charles Rivers editor's edition, this sentence stands out, quote, "There is no documented evidence that he actually ever killed a man," end quote. Now, as I am a curious woman who wants to know where my facts are coming from, I looked up these Charles Rivers guys, and they turn out to be a group founded by Harvard and MIT alums whose aim is to provide expertise to create verified content to publishers, quote, "across a vast range of subject matter," end quote. Still, it seems like it could be apocryphal, right? Could Butch really have been such a nice guy? Charles Griffiths believes so.
Butch Cassidy was a different kind of outlaw. One researcher has said that Butch followed a strict moral code. He didn't kill people during any of his robberies in the American West, and he generally robbed from big companies, railroads, corporations, and not from average people. And another biographer, who interviewed dozens of people who knew Butch, said that they unanimously agreed that he was one of the finest men that they ever knew.
The Harvard guys even stipulate that Butch, quote, "rarely used his gun unless someone shot at him first," end quote. This is a big deal, I guess, in an era where a lot of Western legends are built on how many people you put in the ground. Think Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok and Billy the Kid, whom we covered in Season 3. These guys thrived on their badass reputations. Yet Butch thrived on being an abundantly charismatic, good guy, big-hearted thief of rich people's money. All through my research, I found myself thinking, really? Surely he had a villainous side. Then the stories just kind of pile on. His first arrest, for example, in 1880, when he was still a teenager, happened when he went to buy a few things from a shop near his parents' place. When he got there, the store was closed, but he'd come a long way.
After breaking into the shuttered shop, the future outlaw, planting his roots, took a fancy to a pair of jeans sitting on the shelf and helped himself.
This is from a documentary by Footprints of the Frontier.
He couldn't leave, however, without tripping over his own guilt. Cassidy would leave a note behind before departing, alerting the anonymous store manager he would return at a later date to pay off the debt.
The shopkeeper either didn't find him credible or just thought he was being cheeky, so he had him arrested for theft. The IOU note survived, and a jury later said that this was good enough for them. Not guilty. Another example, I've seen this story in every Cassidy biography I've researched, so I'm going to count on it being true. Seems Butch was arrested early in his thieving career for taking some horses that were not his from other ranches in Circleville. The two lawmen bringing him in stopped for lunch near a shaded tree on a stream. While one of them was dipping into the stream, Butch pushed him in further and grabbed the keys to the handcuffs and took off with both of their horses and his own. But Butch got a ways down the road, and it dawned on him that those guys would have to walk home, and it was a long 30-mile dry-as-a-bone path to get there, and they didn't have any water because he had their canteens. So, good old Butch circled back and handed them their canteens before taking off again. Nice, yes, but Bob, he was still Bob in the 1880s, left home and worked on homesteads nearby that needed hands. But this wasn't 9-to-5 work, neither was it steady. It was just drop in, see what needed to be done, arrange to do it, and get paid. Then he'd wander off to race horses, sometimes conning men into betting against him and his well-trained horses and taking in a few dollars, then rushing out of town before the crowd got wise. If cattle rustling was called for, Bob was adept at that art.
Rustling is basically stealing livestock. Cattle, sheep, horses were the worst offense, and many ranchers at the time didn't see it as overly wrong to take an animal every now and then, thinking that maybe one wouldn't really be missed. Others saw it as a very lucrative business.
So Butch would steal one rancher's cattle to give to another rancher, and back and forth they'd go, which was pretty common in those days. No one bothered to summon the sheriff, at least not in Bob's youth, though that would come to an end soon enough. It's not clear exactly when Bob started going by aliases, but once he did, he cycled through quite a few in his life. George Parker, Bud Parker, Jim Lowe, James Ryan. While still a teen, he left his family to work as a butcher in Rock Springs, Wyoming, and it was there he apparently picked up the name Butch. Get it? He'd been working as a butcher, so they called him Butch. With that prenom, he most frequently began using Cassidy as his surname, apparently in honor of Mike Cassidy, to whom he looked up to.
In Mike Cassidy, Butch may have seen a role model, someone who could go where he pleased and do what he wanted. Mike trained Butch about guns, horses, and the art of rustling. And it was rustling that actually served as a kind of gateway drug into the life of crime that Butch later followed, leading to robbing banks and robbing trains.
Because, let's face it, Bob George Butch Parker had learned early in his life his most important lesson, that working a ranch was hard and there just might be an easier way to earn a living. He found himself hankering for Colorado, specifically a place known as the Telluride, or Telluride, which, as far as historians can tell, is where Butch met Sundance. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Home Chef. These days, it can feel like there's no price difference needing out or staying in, and to make matters worse, there's so many unhealthy options out there to sift through. Am I right or am I right, Scott?
You are right, Amber. But Home Chef can help. They can save you money and help you eat healthier with their fresh, delicious meal kits delivered straight to your door.
Home Chef delivers fresh ingredients and chef-designed recipes conveniently to your doorstep to simplify your cooking experience.
Users of leading meal kits have rated Home Chef #1 in quality, convenience, value, taste, and recipe ease.
Whether you prefer classic meal kits with pre-portioned ingredients, quick 30-minute recipes, oven-ready options, microwave meals, or a dedicated family menu, Home Chef has everything you and your family need for hassle-free, delicious dinners.
It's economical, too. Home Chef customers save an average of $86 per month on groceries.
For a limited time, Home Chef is offering my listeners 50% off and free shipping for your first box, plus free dessert for life. Go to homechef.com/COTC.
That's homechef.com/COTC for 50% off your first box and free dessert for life.
Homechef.com/COTC. Must be an active subscriber to receive free dessert. The Sundance Kid's real name was Harry Longabaugh, and his family, dad, mom, and 5 kids, made their home in or near Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, a mill town. Well, I couch that slightly with the in or near business because it depends on which source you trust. The book my researcher read said Phoenixville, but according to biographics,
Harry Alonzo Longabaugh was born in the spring of 1867 in the village of Montclair, Pennsylvania, the youngest of 5 children of Josiah Longabaugh and Annie Place. Located on the bank of the Schuylkill River, Montclair was a boatman's community where most of the workers had various jobs along the canal, mainly used to ship coal from upstate Pennsylvania to Philadelphia.
In reality, the two spots are really close together on a map. We're talking a mile apart, divided by just a river, so I'm guessing either/both are true in this case. Anyway, Harry was the youngest, but he, like Butch, knew there was more to life than what his family offered. He left home at 13. At 13. Imagine that today. That's mighty young to be working as a boarder at someone else's farm with little or no supervision. But that's what little Harry Longabaugh did. At 14, he took off to Boston and New York and, failing to find good work, took a train to Cortez, Colorado to hook up with a distant cousin who ran a ranch there. Cortez is 75 miles south of Telluride, and the latter city was known for its horse race circuit, and it's presumed that sometime in 1885, this may be where Bob and Harry became at least passing acquaintances. Harry was known as a horse trainer without peer by the time he was 20. He also seemed to not mind pilfering goods when he needed them. On February 27, 1887, Harry took a horse, a saddle, and a revolver from a big ranch near Sundance, Wyoming. The sheriff of Sundance was called upon to find the thief and managed to put him in handcuffs in Miles City, Montana by early April. The sheriff and Harry then took a rather bizarre route back to Sundance.
The duo intended to travel to St. Paul, Minnesota by train, then continue to Rapid City, South Dakota, and finally take the stagecoach to Sundance, thus turning a 300-mile distance into a 2,000-mile journey.
There is no indication why this route was taken, but maybe that's just as well. Anyway, along the route, Harry picked the lock on his shackles, something he would do a lot, and got off the train somehow and vamoosed. Harry, apparently as dumb as a hoe handle, went back to Miles City and was soon enough recaptured. This time, the law put him in steel cuffs, and he eventually got a sentence of 18 months in jail in Sundance. There, he became known as Kid Longabaugh. Then, the whole naming business managed to get that translated to him being the Sundance Kid. That name stuck. Now, I joked that Harry was an idiot, and he did do some idiotic things, but he really wasn't stupid.
Although Harry's education was sporadic, it was said that he was well-read and had his own library card, which he used mainly to check out, what else, Wild West adventures.
It seems more he was a dreamer, and to his credit, he set out to make his dreams his reality, which compels me to take a moment to talk about the whole Wild Bunch legend. This idea that there was this tight-knit little gang of robbers who spent their days holed up in an unbroachable canyon in the middle of nowhere just isn't true. It's a fantasy. Surely not unlike the romantic stories Sundance was reading in his Wild West adventure books. First, the gang was more friends and acquaintances who mixed and matched their way into bank robberies with each other, split the cash, and then went their separate ways. It wasn't one cohesive ride-or-die crew. But they did have a hideout called Robber's Roost in southeastern Utah.
Robber's Roost was a section of land in the foothills of the Henry Mountains. It was incredibly rough and difficult to reach by foot, let alone by wagon or mule.
Their hideout, when they wandered north to Wyoming, was a spot in the south-central part of the state called Hole in the Wall.
Hole in the Wall was a unique feature of Mother Nature, a remote pass located in the heart of the Bighorn Mountains. It served as an Earth-created hideout for outlaws, and at the time of Cassidy's foray into land ownership, its full potential hadn't even begun to be explored.
If the crew wandered south to do work, they made Alma, New Mexico their home. For those of you up on your historic graveyard trivia, that's where Boot Hill Cemetery is located. So there were two Wild West crews that were comprised pretty much of the same array of cowboy hoodlums, the Hole in the Gang, and the Wild Bunch. Amongst their members was Elsie Lay, who some say was more like Butch's sidekick than Sundance was, and guys with the fun names of Tall Texan, News Carver, Laughing Sam Carey, George Flatnose Curry, Harvey Kid Curry Logan, Blackjack Ketchum, and Camilla Deaf Charlie Hanks. Throw in some other guys like Matt Warner, Alan Bob Smith, Bob Taylor, Bob Meeks, and Tom O'Day. That's a lot of Bobs, not to be aliases. Oh, and some even say Jesse and Frank James dropped in from time to time. Author Charles Learson notes that, quote, some writers have called the Wild Bunch the biggest and most structurally complex criminal organization of the late 19th century, end quote. I mean, I remain to be convinced they weren't just making it up as they went. That's not to say I think they were stupid. Again, I do not. According to Charles Kelly's The Outlaw Trail, a history of Butch Cassidy and his Wild Bunch, these hideout destinations were in the West's roughest terrain and were allegedly guarded by well-armed men who stopped anyone who tried to infiltrate their vast system of tunnels that were supposed to be mined. All this had to be traversed before you got to a stockpile of ammo and guns and food and the men who were just passing time while they planned their next heist. I'm ahead of myself now, but I really wanted you to get the hang of the landscape here. These guys were semi-outlaws, rustling cattle and stealing horses for a lot of their resume. The crossover to full-time outlaws, the kind of bad guys that law enforcement or banks or the owner of rail lines cared about, happened in 1889 when Butch and the boys held up a bank in San Miguel Valley, Colorado. Butch's first real bank robbery task was to help plan the getaway from the bank. This is when he came up with the setup that he'd employ on every other job he ever undertook. He stationed fresh horses at strategic points on the getaway route so that while those who followed were dogged by tired horses, his crew was swapping out horses and cruising ahead at light speed. It should be noted that, according to Learson, the law in town in this case just happened to be a friend of the thieves, and he arranged to be out of town that day. For his sudden need to be elsewhere, he was paid $2,300, or what turned out to be 1/10 of the take. A little aside, the take was $22,350. Give or take, that's more than $800,000 in today's money. Not bad. The job itself went swell. Easy in, face masks on, hurdle the counter, stuff money and coin in bags, and whoosh, out the door. Only one hitch. On the road out of there, in the open desert, no masks, they ran into two guys they knew. This was bad. They were no longer anonymous. It was an inauspicious start. A posse was formed, and the idea that they would let up after a few dry, hot miles was proven to be wishful thinking. This bank robbery taught them that things would be different now. Wrote Matt Warner, one of the bank robbers, years later, quote, "We had no idea how taking money from a bank would stir up the whole country against us and lay a dragnet for us in every state and county in the West," end quote. Learson noted that the boys didn't like to be thought of as bad guys, but make no mistake, a whole wad of good guys pursued them through the hot desert and through rain, in the mountains, over hill, over dale, day and night. The thieves finally came to Robber's Roost and stayed there until sometime in the fall when Bob went into Green River, Utah, looking for supplies. He was spotted, and soon enough, a new posse of 4 men was trying to make its way into the treacherous roost. The story is that Bob and his friend Matt Warner became concerned that the diligent lawmen were gonna die out there. So they stood on a promontory in the mountains and pointed the men toward where there was a spring of water. When the foursome got there, Bob and Matt met them, took their guns and pants, yes, I said pants, and told them to go home. They did. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Haya. Typical children's vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy additives growing kids should never eat.
Which is why Haya created a superpowered chewable vitamin. It's made with 0 sugar and 0 gummy additives.
Yet it tastes great and is perfect for picky eaters. Or, as the kiddo in this house likes to say, not picky per se, but just someone with a different taste in food.
That's right.
But they eat their vitamins, which I have no trouble keeping stock because they're delivered automatically to my door every month.
And are you tired of battling with your kids to eat their greens? Haya now has Kids Daily Greens Plus Superfoods, a chocolate-flavored greens powder designed specifically for kids, packed with 55 plus whole food ingredients to support brain power, development, and digestion. Just scoop, shake, and sip with milk and any non-dairy beverage for a delicious and nutritious boost your kids will actually enjoy.
We've worked out a special deal with Haya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order.
To claim this deal, you must go to hayahealth.com/COTC. This deal is not available on their regular website.
Go to HIYAHEALTH.com/COTC and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. Let's interrupt this boy fest for a minute and talk about the women who ran with them. First was Laura Thorny Rose Bullion, a dance hall girl from Texas who was likely also a sex worker, who hooked up with one of the men in the gang and eventually married another. She, like sisters Josie and Ann Bissett, drifted in and out of the hideouts, usually doing the cooking and cleaning, sometimes handling the horses when banks were being cased or robbed. They were well treated, according to stories they themselves told. They all agree that Butch was in charge, and that might be why they were so well treated. Remember, he was an awfully nice outlaw. And then there was the now legendary Etta Place. One dubious source says she was the daughter of an aristocratic Irish family who got off the boat in the United States and decided to go west. This is doubted by most historians who have looked high and low for exactly who this woman was, where she came from, and when she met Butch in Sundance. They all seem to be certain that her first name was actually Edith, which doesn't quite have the allure of Etta, especially not when you're thinking of her as played by Catherine Ross in the 1969 movie. She was stunning in that role.
Butch, do you ever wonder if I'd met you first, we'd been the ones to get involved?
Well, we are involved, Etta. Don't you know that?
Based on the only known photograph of the real Etta with Sundance, she was also stunning in real life. We don't know much about Etta beyond that. We don't know her family name. Place came from Sundance. It was Harry Longabo's mother's maiden name, and this is assumed to be the reason she chose it as her alias. Because, as the movie clip conveyed, Etta was Sundance's lady, maybe even his wife. Did he love her? There seems to be little doubt he did. Now, how little we know about Etta is highlighted in this from an episode of the Outlaw Stories by VoiceOver Outlaw on YouTube.
According to a memorandum from the Pinkerton Detective Agency, dated July 29, 1902, she was said to be from Texas, and in another Pinkerton document dated 1906, she is described as being 27 to 28 years old, placing her birth between 1878 and 1879. A hospital staff record from Denver, where she received treatment in May 1900, reports her age as 22 or 23, putting her birth year at 1877 or 1878. The Pinkertons called her Ethel, Eva, and Rita, before finally settling on Etta for its wanted posters.
Now, according to some historians, Etta and Ann Bassett were the same woman. In fact, a computer analyst at Los Alamos National Laboratory is convinced that, based on photographs and telling characteristics such as a scar and a cowlick, there is no doubt Ann morphed into Etta at some point. But there's this one hitch to that. Ann was known to be in Wyoming and Utah when Etta was known to be in South America. I mean, Ann was actually in jail briefly in 1903 for cattle rustling. So for the two women to be one and the same, some of that documentation has to be false. What happened to Etta after, say, 1906 or so, depends on who you believe. She could have been moved to Texas, or taught school in Denver, or married a wealthy man in Paraguay, or opened a brothel, or fled to New York, or was the woman who asked for Sundance's death certificate, only to be told in 1909 that none existed. Or maybe she was a few of those things, or none of them. Her life, like Butch and Sundance's deaths, makes for lively discussions on Old West chat rooms and dissertations in academic papers and in novels. All right, back to where we left off. It's 1889 and still in the U.S. Suffice to say that for the next decade, Butch and his various friends held up a lot of banks and mostly got away with it. They would manage to blow that money pretty fast, on women, at cards, who knows, and would soon need to find another town and some other company's payroll arriving at some new bank at the precise time they'd need to nab it, to maximize their take. Call it the decade of banks and debauchery. So now it's 1899, the end of the century. Butch and the boys, by now he is Butch Cassidy to those who know him and those he steals from and to those who read newspapers, and in a place called Wilcox Station, things are about to change. Because it's now been decided that more money was being hauled around the country in trains than was sitting in bags in banks. On June 2nd, 1899, the engineer on the Union Pacific's Overland Limited No. 1 saw someone down the tracks flash a red lantern at him. It was after 2 a.m., and that meant something was amiss. Maybe a stopped train or a bad switch or something. The Overland No. 1 stopped. It was probably Sundance who had signaled the engineer, but it was Butch who appeared just then, crawling over the coal bin and saying, more or less, "Stick 'em up."
They held up a majority of the passengers, and after departing the train, they ran off with a 5-figure sum. Depending on who you talk to, the number ranges anywhere from $30,000 to $50,000. That's upwards of $1.8 million in modern times when adjusted for inflation, a lucrative pull rarely seen in the latter part of the Wild West era.
But it wasn't just about the money. As part of the heist, the Wild Bunch, or 4 of them at least, found the train's mail cart, stuck some dynamite on the track under it, and blew it up. While no one was injured, this was not pretty. It scared the passengers and horses. The mail car attendant was thrown around a bit and was covered in red, which was scarier looking than it actually was. Turned out to be raspberry jam that had been in the mail car's hold very near the safe, which yielded a tidy sum. The important upshot of this train robbery, and it would certainly not be the last, was that the head of Union Pacific, a guy named E.H. Harriman, was not amused. He immediately set a few hundred men after the robbers and then sought out the Pinkerton Detective Agency so they too could go on the hunt for those little punks who were ruining his business. A short time later, a few men, also wild bunchers, decided they would pull off a heist of a Colorado and Southern Railroad train and came away with some $70,000. But this is not a foolproof business. Some bad guys were badly injured and some good guys were killed. Other similar acts led to prison sentences for some of Butch's friends. The outlaws were officially bad guys now. And maybe, just maybe, as the century turned, Butch and Sundance were thinking that they could rustle up a do-over. There was even talk of some kind of amnesty deal between Butch and the governor of Utah. Confess to a few small things, serve a little time, get a pardon. But it didn't happen. And another Union Pacific train got blown up shortly after the deal fell through. Some say Butch was there, some say he wasn't. Author Learson posits the theory that Butch and Sundance didn't leave the outlaw life as much as it was leaving them. Times were changing. The remoteness of their targets, their hideouts, and the very lack of communication between outposts was changing so fast that the West wasn't the West anymore. It was getting to be just like any other part of the United States. It wasn't safe for cowboys or train robbers. Regardless, Pinkerton detectives were closing in. Some had gotten their hands on portraits of Butch and Sundance and were using the images to track the men down. It seemed the duo sensed the pressure was on. From a grunge documentary.
Sundance took Ep6 to New Orleans to celebrate the new year before the couple traveled to Pennsylvania to meet Sundance's family. The two next went to New York, where they saw a doctor for some unknown ailment and joined up with Cassidy. During their time in New York, Cassidy, Sundance, and Place used various aliases as they spent 3 weeks seeing the sights.
This was the fall of 1900. For Sundance and Etta, parts of this sojourn seemed downright honeymoon-esque, like when they stayed in Niagara Falls before going to New York City to get tickets for a steamer to head south. To be clear, we're talking south. The trio decided to go to South America, which they figured was a good half-century behind the US in almost everything. Seemed perfect. They settled, more or less, in the remotest part of Argentina known as Chubut. Butch wrote his friend Elsie Lay, fun fact, he was somehow related to the Lay's potato chip fortune, and explained, quote, "I'm a long way from civilization, 1,600 miles to Buenos Aires, over 400 miles to the nearest real road or seaport," end quote. The threesome lived together. Butch had a separate bedroom, and Sundance and Etta acted as a couple. Together they raised horses and had cows and succeeded at that pretty grandly. In all, they spent at least 7 years in South America. The first of those years, the boys made an honest living. But historians have good evidence that Butch, Sundance, some other American, and Etta, she held the horses apparently, robbed a bank in Mercedes, a city in Buenos Aires province in the spring of 1906. Their take? About 20 grand. But one of the four killed a banker in the process, and the rumor mill began to work its magic, blaming Butch and Sundance for a wide array of successful bank robberies and a variety of Bolivian locales. It is now that Ep6 goes missing from history. Maybe, like Catherine Ross told Paul Newman and Robert Redford in the '69 movie, she didn't want to stay there and watch them die. Maybe she left then. Or maybe she left when they did. The ending of the story seems like it should be straightforward. Of course, it isn't. But here's what's supposed to have happened. On November 4th, 1908, a mining company courier named Carlos Pero was robbed by two masked men in the Bolivian Andes. This happened early in the morning. The Bolivians had been told by the Pinkertons that two notorious thieving Americans had escaped to their neck of the woods, and they were convinced they'd cornered the desperados while holed up in a house in the small village of San Vicente. A soldier in the Bolivian cavalry approached the house and was fatally shot. That was enough to launch a shootout that ended with both men inside the house dead. From world history documentaries.
At dawn the next day, the troopers ordered the owner of the hut to investigate. Inside were two corpses. One, thought to be the Sundance Kid, had a small caliber bullet wound to the temple and several other gunshot wounds. A second, thought to be Butch Cassidy, also had arm wounds and a small caliber bullet wound to the temple. Sundance had been badly hurt. It looked as if Butch had put him out of his misery, then shot himself. It looked like a murder-suicide.
So, this seems open and shut, right? Yeah, not so much. The only witness to the actual payroll robbery was Carlos Pero, who, despite having said repeatedly that the men who took the bags of money from him had been masked and their hats had been brought low over their eyes, identified the dead pair as those men the Americans had been looking for, namely Butch and Sundance. Yeah, but were they? When someone, maybe Etta, in 1909 asked for the death certificates of the men in the cabin, authorities released documents identifying the men as unknown. How they came to be tied to Butch and Sundance is because the Bolivian army had been alerted to the men's presence because someone in the town where the two men had been hiding out in a small house recognized the mule the men had with them. That someone said the mule had belonged to the Arromayo mining company, which had been robbed by the two American bandidos. When the army reported what had happened in San Vicente, they claimed they found the Arromayo mine money and a map of Bolivia. Despite an inquest, no one in authority identified the bodies, which were hurried into local graves in the town cemetery, and no one bothered to report to the public at large that Bolivian authorities believed they killed two of the most notorious Wild West figures in American history. In fact, you search through newspaper databases and you see sightings reported all across the world, in Europe, Mexico, Ireland, and, of course, throughout the U.S. The Pinkerton detectives didn't stop looking for them either. I found a story published in 1910, finally headlined, "Had a Wild Time in Bolivia, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid Shot to Death." But the story doesn't offer up a source and even says outright that no one positively identified the men. In 1914, a bunch of the bandits' friends gathered money in a GoFundMe kind of deal to send a young man named Billy Sawtell to find out what he could in Bolivia. He came back saying, yep, that was them. Nobody believed him, and the truth is, nobody wanted to. According to the Charles River Editor Bunch, the most enduring story about Sundance is that he lived as William Henry Long in Utah, married a widow with 6 kids, and died by his own hand in 1936. They also advise that, quote, John M. McCullough, a biological anthropologist from Utah State University, said that he examined a photograph of Sundance and compared it to a photograph of Long. He said in court, quote, "It is clear that these two photographs are of the same person, giving the court reason to grant the request to exhume Long," end quote. When authorities did so in 2008, testing results proved inconclusive. A relentless couple, Dan Buck and Ann Meadows, have gone the extra mile in trying to find out what happened to the outlaws. In their book, Digging Up Butch and Sundance, they've outlined at least 60 different versions of how the two men died. Buck and Meadows went to San Vicente in 1991 and began digging around for the graves, ready to perform any DNA tests on any reasonable candidate. Near where the sign reads, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, they disinterred, with permission of the locals, a few skeletons. One ended up being a German miner named Gustav Zimmer. The others were native Bolivians. Some other bones are located in a museum in San Vicente that purport to be the bandits. no one thinks that's likely. A theory more people seem willing to embrace came from Butch's own sister, who'd been a baby when he left the Circleville Ranch. She wrote in a 1975 book that she knew for certain he didn't die in Bolivia. Footprints on the frontier again.
Cassidy's own birth sister, Mrs. Lulu Parker Bettinson, was certain her brother had paid her and their family a similar visit in 1925. Her story goes that Cassidy surprised their brother, Mark Parker, in town one day and picked him up in his new Ford automobile. Together, the brothers drove the car to their father's cabin, where Bettinson was living at the time. According to her, Maximilian Parker looked at his daughter and said, "I'll bet you don't know who this is. This is your brother, Robert Leroy." The Parkers then sat at their dining room table to share a freshly made blueberry pie. Reportedly, Cassidy spoke openly about his life on the run, honest about his regret and shame for disappointing his parents, but most of all, his mother.
So surely Lula told us where Butch was buried, and our advances in forensic science can confirm all, right? Well, wrong.
She never informed anyone of his exact resting place, however, believing he had spent his entire life running from the law and deserved to finally rest in peace.
Other people in her family said she never provided the deeds because, well, she was full of it. They believed, or at least they said they believed, that Butch and Sundance indeed died in a murder-suicide in Bolivia. Maybe they did, or maybe they escaped and lived out their natural lives in hiding. Either way, it's safe to say they remain in death what they were in life. Elusive, and a hell of a good story. To research this case, journalist Amy Wilson read Charles Learson's book, Butch Cassidy, The True Story of an American Outlaw, Dan Buck and Ann Meadows' book, Digging Up Butch and Sundance, the Charles Rivers editor's book, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Lives and Legacies of the Wild West Famous Outlaw Duo, and also referenced Lula Parker Bettinson's book, Butch Cassidy, My Brother. She and I also read contemporary news articles as well as retrospective pieces on the Outlaws. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/grabbagcollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this show was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Benskoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com.